While some horror movies have one straight-up villainous threat, others enjoy playing with expectations and having those primary villains being forced to face off with something or someone even more terrifying, insane, and bloodthirsty. And it's on those greater evils that our focus is on here. I'm Andrew from What Culture Horror, and here are horror movie villains who encountered something worse. The Deinos family, ready or not? In Ready or Not, newlywed Grace learns the family she's married into, that'd be the Deinos dynasty, made a historic pact with a demonic entity. In exchange for their vast riches, the family agreed to put everyone who marries into the family through a ritual where they must play a random game from the entity's puzzle box. In Grace's case, she picks hide and seek, with the catch being that the Deinos must kill Grace before dawn or end up paying the ultimate price of them all dying instead. Miraculously, Grace manages to outlast the family, resulting in the surviving Deinos starting to explode into a bloody mist, all as Grace watches on with perverse fascination. Mother Marcos, Suspiria, 2018. The primary antagonist of Luca Guadagnino's Suspiria remake is Mother Helena Marcos, a grotesquely shriveled old witch who holds dominion over her coven and after whom the Central Marcos Dance Academy is of course named. In the climax, protagonist Susie is said to become the young new vessel for Mother Marcos, except Susie has quite the surprise. She is actually the Grand Witch Mother Suspiriorum, not Marcos. More to the point, Susie intends to kill Marcos and takes the academy for herself, which is exactly what she does, as Marcos is helpless to do anything but watch as Susie summons death itself to rob Marcos to nothing and explode the heads of her most zealous followers. Though the particulars of precisely what Susie is remains a little ambiguous by Suspiria's end, she was clearly a hell of a lot more than Mother Marcos was counting on. Clint Owens, Antlers. In the time-honored tradition of a scumbag bully getting their just desserts, we have Antlers Clint Owens, who spends most of his screen time tormenting his poor classmate Lucas. That is, until Clint decides to harass Lucas in the woods, only to be met by Lucas's father, Frank. But Frank, yeah, he's not merely some protective papa bear. Oh, no. By this point, Frank's been transformed into an abominable antlered creature following an attack he survived earlier in the movie. So, in his bestial form, Frank leaps from a tree and brutally mauls Clint to death, the little prick. All while Lucas does the only smart thing and runs for his life. Clint's terrified screams, combined with the brutal flesh-ripping sounds, are horrific enough to almost make you feel sorry for the kid. Almost. But as they say, karma's a you-know-what, whether you're a child or not. Martin, Army of the Dead. Where living, breathing humans are concerned, Army of the Dead's most detestable character is absolutely 1000% Martin, a member of the Central Heist team who has ulterior motives beyond helping pull off their ambitious apocalyptic casino heist. Martin, an employee of casino owner Blythe Tanaka, is actually after the decapitated head of the zombie queen, which, with its ability to create an entire army of zombies, is far more valuable than the contents of the casino's vault. Martin even traps the remaining members of the team in the basement once he thinks he's got the head, but he only has moments to realize he's been duped before he comes face to face with something even worse than a fleet of the undead. You see, Martin is suddenly mauled to death by a zombie tiger, and it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Scar, Alien vs Predator. Even though Scar the Predator ultimately joins forces with human survivor Lex, that's only because Scar realizes, he's up against a bigger, meaner beast, that being the Xenomorph. The Predators may be the lesser of two evils here, but they do still rack up quite the human body count all the same. However, while Scar, with the help of Lex, stops the Xenomorphs from escaping to the surface and running riot on Earth, Scar's defeat of the Queen results in his own death, fatally impaled by the Queen's tail. Even worse than death though, an earlier facehugger attack leaves Scar impregnated with a Predalien hybrid, which bursts out of his chest in ooey-gooey fashion in the film's final moments. William Afton, Five Nights at Freddy's. Five Nights at Freddy's' not so shocking third act twist is that career counselor Steve Raglan is actually secretly the movie's primary villain, William Afton. Afton is a serial killer who murdered a group of children and hid their bodies in the animatronics that populate Freddy's Fazbear's Pizza, leaving their souls under his control. However, at the end of the movie, our hero Mike and his sister Abby are able to remind the possessed animatronics of how they came to be this way, in turn freeing them of Afton's influence and causing them to turn on him. To be fair though, Afton clearly knew he was dabbling in some heinous stuff here, so this is basically the dictionary definition of F around and find out, which he very much did. Athena Stone, The Hunt. In polarizing satirical horror film The Hunt, Athena Stone is the leader of the central group of wealthy elites who kidnap working class folk, or deplorables as they call them, and hunt them just for kicks. And as Athena's complacency left her assuming that those deplorables didn't pose much of a threat, she evidently got far more than she bargained for with gutsy captive Crystal. During their final confrontation, the two impale each other with the blades of a food processor, before Crystal finally delivers the killing blow to Athena. Just to rub salt in the wound, as Athena bleeds out, she realizes that not only is Crystal far more well-read than her classism let her realize, but that she actually mistook Crystal for a different Crystal who offended her on social media. Crystal didn't just physically defeat Athena, she intellectually outmaneuvered her too, and you absolutely love to see it. Albert Wesker, Resident Evil, the final chapter. Though the penultimate Resident Evil film concluded with Alice reluctantly teaming up with franchise villain Albert Wesker, of course they were looking to take down Umbrella's Red Queen AI, that was all basically tossed out in the final chapter. Here we learn that Wesker was basically telling Porky Pies, because of course he is, about the Red Queen, and swiftly he betrays Alice, prompting the Red Queen to instead align with Alice to infiltrate Umbrella and save what remains of humanity. In the film's climax, Wesker believes himself unable to be harmed by the Red Queen, because after all, he's a member of Umbrella's payroll. However, Umbrella co-owner Alicia Marcus swiftly fires him, at which point making Wesker fair game for the Red Queen because he's now an ex-Umbrella employee. With Wesker caught off guard by all of this, he's crushed by a giant door, with Alice leaving a dead man's switch in his hand, which means that when Wesker bleeds out, a series of bombs will go off and obliterate his remains. Captain Rhodes, Day of the Dead. George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead series loves to foreground the atrocities committed by humans, and that's perhaps never more evident than in Day of the Dead, where the survivors are left at the mercy of the unstable, paranoia-stricken Captain Rhodes. Rhodes's dictatorial attitude only further worsens the already strained relationships between the soldiers and scientists stuck together in an underground bunker, and by the film's end, it's safe to say that his violently psychopathic ways result in a lot of death. As such, it's tough not to relish Rhodes' well-earned demise, where after leaving his own to die once the undead swarm the bunker, he's shot in the stomach by friendly zombie Bub, and then brutally torn apart by the nearby horde. Rhodes proved himself to be totally outfoxed when it came to Bub and the zombies, and given that Bub sarcastically salutes him in his dying moments, Rhodes sure as hell knew it too. The Sharks, Sharknado, The Fourth Awakens. To quote Qui-Gon Jinn, hey there Star Wars fans, there's always a bigger fish, and that was very much the case in Sharknado, The Fourth Awakens. This fourth movie ends with Hero Finn swallowed by a shark, that's then swallowed by a bigger shark, that's swallowed by an even bigger shark, which in turn is swallowed by a massive shark. 4 sharks, Fourth Awakens. You get it? You see what they've done there? Yeah. Of course, because Sharknado never saw a joke and didn't run into the ground, that's still not the end of the matter, as a colossal blue whale emerges out of nowhere and eats the massive shark, which somehow isn't the end for Finn, as he cuts through the whale shark layers with his trusty chainsaw, because of course he did.
Rocky, Alex and Money, Don't Breathe. Don't Breathe does a fantastic job of appearing to pit a trio of unambiguous villains against a severely outmatched hero, only to flip the script in a brilliantly unpleasant way. The film begins with 3 young criminals, Rocky, Alex and Money, breaking into the home of blind Gulf War veteran Norman Nordstrom, with the intent of stealing the $300,000 Norman received as a settlement following his daughter's death in a car accident. It initially seems pretty damn cut and dried that Norman is the embattled person to root for here, only for him to not only prove unexpectedly capable of fighting back against the trio, but also reveal a seriously dark secret. As we learn much later in the story, Norman has kidnapped the woman who killed his daughter, artificially inseminated her with his own seed, and left her pregnant and chained up in his basement. Now, robbing a bereaved blind guy is scummy as all hell, but I would argue that Norman's crimes are a hell of a lot worse. The Masked Killers, You're Next. The genius of Adam Wingard's You're Next is that it's structured like a pretty typical home invasion horror flick, only to completely turn its seemingly familiar setup on its head. An estranged family finds themselves under attack by a group of killers wearing animal masks during a family reunion at a remote holiday home. But what nobody counted on, neither victims nor perpetrators, was one of the attacked being more than a little prepared to defend themselves. As it turns out, the seemingly normal Erin grew up in a survivalist compound where she was taught advanced self-defense and survival skills. And so pretty much any time Erin ends up facing off against one of the masked murderers, she makes short work of them in supremely satisfyingly brutal fashion. The killers assumed that their scheme to kill the family in order to claim the insurance money would go off without a hitch, only for Erin's combat readiness to completely ruin everything for them. You love to see it. The Cenobites, Hellbound Hellraiser II. Because apparently these Cenobites aren't terrifying enough, Hellbound Hellraiser II had them face off against Dr. Philip Channard, who is secretly obsessed with the Lament configuration and teams up with a resurrected Julia Cotton throughout the film. Though Julia eventually betrays him to her own ends, she gets killed for it, whereas Channard initially survives to be transformed into a Cenobite himself by their malevolent creator, Leviathan. But Channard's supreme achievement? He uses his newfound abilities to quite effortlessly kill Pinhead and the other Cenobites, who were admittedly weakened after being reminded of their prior humanity. It's a creative decision which didn't exactly sit well with many fans, especially after how powerful Pinhead and co. were shown to be in the first Hellraiser movie. But Channard's own time comes soon thereafter when his head is parted from his body. Jang Kyung-chul, I Saw the Devil. Kim Ji-woon's I Saw the Devil is a seriously messed up movie revolving around an intelligence agent, Kim Soo-hyun, who seeks revenge on Jang Kyung-chul, the serial killer who brutally murdered his fiancée. And Kyung-chul evidently didn't expect to encounter someone capable of outdoing him on the deranged front, but our vengeance-obsessed protagonist certainly gets there in the end. Throughout the film, he repeatedly captures and releases the killer in order to prolong his torment, which in turn allows him to commit more sexual assaults and murders. Not a great look. But the piece de resistance comes at film's end, when our protagonist tortures Kyung-chul in his own home, placing him in a makeshift guillotine. At that moment, Kyung-chul's estranged son and elderly parents arrive, and opening the front door triggers the guillotine, decapitating him in front of them. Though our protagonist achieves precisely what he set out to do, the ending doesn't suggest even a slither of catharsis for him. Rather the opposite, that in his quest for revenge, he's become something unconscionably ugly. The Gecko Brothers, From Dusk Till Dawn. Robert Rodriguez's thriller doesn't even show its full genre hand until the midway point, with the first half of the movie unfolding as a relatively familiar yet still terrifically entertaining crime thriller. The film's villain protagonists are bank robber brothers Seth and Richie, who end up taking hostage a pastor, Jacob Fuller, and his family, who are assuredly the heroes of the piece. Yet that all changes when the brothers and the Fuller family arrive at the Titty Twister, a strip club in the remote Mexican desert, which they soon enough discover is infested with vampires. This marks a major tonal and narrative shift as the Geckos and Fullers team up to fend off the bloodthirsty assailants, ensuring being held at gunpoint by a pair of human thieves is the last thing the Fullers are now worried about. Chris Cleek, the woman. The woman is centered around a lawyer, Chris Cleek, who stumbles across the titular feral woman while out hunting and decides to kidnap her in an attempt to civilize her. In the ensuing days, Chris inflicts brutal torture upon the woman in his deranged quest to tame her, which is really just an excuse for him to enact his vile misogynist fantasies. Chris and his son Brian abuse both the woman and their own family, Chris's wife and 2 daughters, yet fail to appreciate that the woman isn't merely feral, she's a violent cannibal. And so in the third act, she's finally sprung from her confinement and makes short work of the Cleek men, murdering Brian with a saw and then ripping Chris's heart out and eating it, because why the hell not? In moral terms, Chris is clearly the real monster here, yet he didn't even remotely anticipate the possibility that the woman was capable of such grotesque, savage displays of violence. Hogs Gang, No One Lives. No One Lives appears to follow a pretty well-trod formula at first, as a couple, Betty and a man known only as Driver, are preyed upon by a gang of thieves led by the vicious Hogue. Yet, in a supreme case of bad luck for the robbers, it turns out they've basically targeted the worst person imaginable, given that Driver is actually a secret serial killer and he's very, very good at his job. Driver doesn't take long to escape his restraints and start working his way through Hogue and his gang in revenge for Betty's death, and the guy is willing to do just about anything to get the job done, even hiding inside the corpse of one of his victims in order to reach the gang's hideout. Yep. Ultimately, Driver is an efficient and brutal enough killer that you might even end up feeling just a teensy bit sorry for his victims. Again, only a tiny bit though. Simon Canton, Deep Rising. Deep Rising is primarily remembered as that movie where a luxury ocean liner is preyed upon by a gigantic deep-sea monster, but there's also a human villain to speak of. Simon Canton is the owner of the Focal luxury cruise ship, and as is revealed halfway through the movie, he conspired to have the unprofitable ship sabotaged and sunk so that he could claim the insurance. Basically, had Canton not sabotaged the ship in the first place, the passengers inside likely wouldn't have been preyed upon by the monster. And of course, Canton certainly didn't bank on his plan being interrupted by said monster. Yet ultimately Canton is hoisted by his own petard, as when fleeing the ship on a boat he breaks his leg and loses his glasses, leaving him unable to deactivate the boat's autopilot, causing it to careen straight into the ship, detonating the onboard torpedoes and killing him instantly. Glorious. Rose the Hat, Dr. Sleep. The primary antagonist of Mike Flanagan's criminally underappreciated Dr. Sleep is Rose the Hat, who leads a cult of psychics known as the True Knot that extend their lifespans by killing those who possess the shining and consuming the steam that's released. Rose is an extremely powerful psychic, who nevertheless comes undone in the film's climax when Danny Torrance lures her to the Overlook Hotel. Though Rose quite easily overpowers Danny, he unlocks the psychic lockboxes in his mind and in turn unleashes the hotel's ghosts, which then overwhelm Rose and quickly devour her before she's able to put up even the faintest semblance of a fight. That's quite the novel way to do away with a seemingly unstoppable villain, by sicking the terrifying entities from a traumatic event in one's youth upon your current enemy. Or, to put it in filmmaking terms, having the villains from the first movie defeat the sequel's villain. John Kramer, Saw X. Even though Saw X is set relatively early into John Kramer's reign of terror as a serial killer at large, taking place between the first two Saw movies as it does, he was still a serious piece of work at this point, being responsible for numerous deaths, no matter what he might claim. But Saw X impressively shifted Kramer into a protagonist role, while focusing on the very incident which solidified his resolve to continue his games. Much of the film is focused around Kramer being duped into undergoing an apparently experimental medical procedure to remove his brain cancer. Yet it ultimately turns out that the doctor fronting the operation is actually a con artist. And in case scamming the desperately cancer-riddled out of their remaining life savings wasn't repugnant enough, she becomes increasingly sociopathic as the movie goes on, to the point of even grabbing a local boy and forcing him into one of Jigsaw's own traps. Say what you will about John Kramer, but the guy never put an objectively innocent child into a contraption. Kramer's "I never killed anyone" logic is totally absurd, yet at least the guy has a moral logic in his own mind. Cecilia, though? She's totally beyond this. There's nobody she won't step over to enrich herself, and to rub salt in the wound, she even makes it to the end of the movie in one piece.
Stephen Wilkins, Trick or Treat. In Michael Dougherty's terrific horror anthology Trick or Treat, school principal Stephen Wilkins works a second job on the side. That is, he's a Halloween-loving serial killer who murders children who don't appreciate the spirit of the season. And because that's not bad enough, he's also grooming his young son Billy to follow in his footsteps. In one of Trick or Treat's later stories, though, Wilkins dresses up as a vampire and attacks young out-of-towner Laurie, only to quickly learn that he picked on the very worst person possible. Laurie's sister and friends reveal they're actually werewolves, before Laurie herself transforms into one and decides Wilkins will be her first ever victim, having been waiting for someone who thoroughly deserved to be killed. With that, a pathetic, terrified Wilkins can do nothing but watch helplessly as Laurie devours him. Stans and Edwin, Predators. Predators revolves around a group of skilled killers who are abducted and dumped on a planet to be hunted by two feuding tribes. The killers range from more morally ambiguous soldiers, mercenaries, and enforcers, the worst of the bunch undeniably being Stans, a death row inmate with many murders to his name, and Edwin, a serial killer who spends most of the movie posing as a harmless doctor. Both men, along with most of the movie's other characters, soon come to realize they're not quite at the top of the food chain. Stans puts up a solid fight against one of the Predators, but ultimately has his spine ripped out for his troubles, never pleasant, while Edwin is neutralized with his own paralytic agent and rigged up with grenades which blow him to pieces. In each case, these psychopaths thought they were untouchable, only to find out they were facing off against something that had them thoroughly licked. Eli Deinos, Blade 2. Blade 2 attempts to up the ante from the original movie by revealing that a pandemic has begun turning vampires into reapers. That would be primal, bloodthirsty mutants who can transform humans and vampires alike into their kind. As it turns out, the plague was actually caused by Eli Deinos, the leader of the Vampire Nation, who, in an attempt to create stronger vampires, inadvertently made the Reapers, whose numbers quickly grew out of control. Recognizing a threat to both humans and vampires, Deinos decides to strike a truce with Blade, who wasn't actually aware of Deinos Damaskinos' botched experiment to wipe out the Reapers. Basically, in his quest to make vampires better, this rogue created a terrifying offshoot that would gladly feed on vampires as much as humans. Worse still, Reapers were equipped with all the advantages Damaskinos intended for his own kind, such as enhanced strength and durability, a bone-covered heart making them harder to stake, resistance to silver and garlic, and more efficient blood-sucking apparatus. Hogs Gang, the last house on the left. Wes Craven's vicious exploitation classic The Last House on the Left follows teenage girls Mary and Phyllis, who are preyed upon by a gang of psychopathic criminals led by the vile Krug. Ultimately, both Mary and Phyllis are abused and killed by Krug and his crew, who then unintentionally end up seeking refuge at the home of Mary's parents. Mary's mother Estelle overhears them discussing her daughter's murder, and after she and her husband John find Mary's dead body in the woods, revenge is the order of the day. Estelle pretends to seduce one of the gang, Weasel, only to bite his, off and let him bleed to death before she then slits the throat of another, Sadie, all while John tears Krug apart with a chainsaw just as a sheriff arrives, no less. If it seemed like Krug's gang was going to make short work of Mary's parents, yeah, those tables were turned in fine fashion. The Hijackers, Blood Red Sky. Blood Red Sky offers up a pretty unique spin on the well-worn plain hijacking thriller by having the hijackers realize they're facing off against a darn vampire. Shortly after a plane to New York takes off, terrorists led by Burke seize control of the aircraft and reveal they're holding it to ransom. The hijackers weren't expecting much in the way of opposition from the plane's terrified passengers, of course, but in a brilliant twist, they didn't count on one of them, Nadja, being a vampire. The audience is initially led to believe that Nadja is afflicted with leukemia, but the mid-film rug pull reveals she's actually been concealing her vampirism, after which she starts going full ham on the hijackers, Air Force One style, but with more blood sucking. Ultimately, all hell breaks loose, with one of the hijackers even willingly becoming a vampire himself and turning comrades and passengers alike into fellow vamps. In the end, only Nadja's son and another passenger survive the ordeal, a far cry from what the terrorists surely assume would be a pretty smooth and easy hijacking. Dr. Philip Decker, Nightbreed. Clyde Parker's Nightbreed follows mentally unstable Aaron Boone, who is convinced by his psychotherapist Dr. Philip Decker that he's a serial killer, despite it actually being Decker himself who is the murderer. Decker compels Boone to turn himself in for these crimes, but before he can do so, Decker receives directions to the underground city of Midgen, where he encounters the Nightbreed, a community of supernatural creatures and oddballs. After leaving Midgen, an at-large Boone is shot dead by the police, but because Boone was bitten by one of the Nightbreed, he ends up reanimated, allowing him to return to Midgen and be formally initiated as a member of the Nightbreed. Basically, Decker's plan to frame somebody else for his murders goes hilariously wrong, putting him in the path of the monsters he loathed so much. In the end, Decker has the ultimate indignity forced upon him. After being killed by Boone, he's resurrected as a Nightbreed himself by the unhinged Father Ashbury, becoming the very thing he hated. Ah, that's some karma for you. The bullies, Let the Right One In. There's a debate about who the real villain is in Let the Right One In, but for protagonist Oscar, it's most certainly the group of bullies who relentlessly terrorize him at school. In the film's climax, they reveal the full extent of their casual cruelty when one of the leaders, Jimmy, forces Oscar to hold his head underwater at knife point for 3 minutes in a local swimming pool, threatening to cut out his eye if he resurfaces early. As Oscar is held underwater though, his vampiric pal Ellie arrives on the scene and promptly dispatches the kids, brutally dismembering and killing all but the single most reluctant of the bullies, who was evidently traumatized by the incident, because you would be. To be fair to the bullies here, they couldn't possibly expect that the kid they were tormenting would be best buddies with a centuries-old vampire, but all the same, their behavior is callously violent enough that it's tough to feel much sympathy for them whatsoever. The Animatronics, Willie's Wonderland. Willie's Wonderland is about as close to being a Five Nights at Freddy's ripoff as one can possibly get without being legally actionable. The film is centered around an abandoned family entertainment center, which plays host to 8 animatronic creatures that are possessed by the souls of a serial killer and his 7 cannibalistic buddies. There are human villains in the mix too, namely a corrupt Sheriff Lund who made a pact with the animatronics to offer up random drifters as sacrifices under the guise of getting said drifters to clean up the building. But neither the cursed animatronics nor Sheriff Lund counted on the latest drifter, as played by Nicolas Cage, to put up much resistance, only for him to go absolutely hog wild and start murdering his way through them. Ultimately, Cage's silent unnamed hero manages to dismantle the animatronics pretty persuasively, while Lund is herself ripped in half by the lead animatronic, that'd be Willie. Neither Lund nor the diabolical animatronics quite knew what they were dealing with here, a man of no words, but of much brutality. Arkin O'Brien, the Collector. The Collector franchise is especially unique given that it really kinda cuts both ways. For starters, protagonist Arkin O'Brien is by no means a good dude. The man plots to steal a precious ruby from the home of a family he works for in order to pay off his wife's debts to loan sharks. But after breaking in, Arkin discovers the family's already having a bit of a rough night as they're being targeted by a serial killer called the Collector. Being robbed by Arkin would have been trivial compared to this, but to Arkin's credit, he does attempt to rescue the family rather than just, fleeing at the first opportunity, even if all but one of the family do indeed end up dead. Arkin's heroic turnaround is ultimately rewarded in the ending when the Collector captures him and shoves him in a trunk, leading to a sequel, The Collection, which flips this concept on its head. Arkin escapes the Collector's clutches at the start of that sequel, and in the finale tracks the unmasked Collector down, where he forces him into a trunk at gunpoint while vowing to torture and kill him. That'll show him. Evidently, the killer severely underestimated Arkin's resourcefulness, and though we never got to see the Collector's final fate play out on screen, partially due to a planned third film being cancelled mid-production, he was outfoxed by a more cunning creature in the end. The Mercenaries, Scarecrows. 1988 slasher film Scarecrow sees 5 ex-military mercenaries steal $3 million from Count Pendleton and hijack a plane in order to escape to Mexico. But after one of the squad steals the loot and parachutes out, the others are forced to disembark into farmland and track him down. However, they don't simply have a duplicitous former teammate to worry about, because they now find themselves being hunted by a trio of scarecrows who happen to be possessed by the spirits of 3 dead satanic farmers. Because of course they do. Even accepting that Scarecrows feels like 2 separate scripts which got forcibly collided together, it does make for an amusing twist on a more well-trod thriller concept. You can practically picture a producer telling the filmmakers, mercenaries turn on each other? Nah pal, it's played out. You know what this needs? Supernaturally animated scarecrows. And they'd be right.
King Willie, Predator 2. Predator 2 is a somewhat underrated sequel which ambitiously shifts the action from the actual jungle to the concrete jungle of sweltering late 90s Los Angeles. The city has become overrun by gang warfare between Colombian and Jamaican drug cartels, and never one to shy away from a good challenge, the Predator can't help but throw himself into the middle of it. Throughout the film, the Predator indiscriminately slaughters both sides, and causes quite the headache for the dumbfounded LAPD. At one point, Lieutenant Mike Harrigan, played by Danny Glover, pays a visit to King Willie, played by Calvin Lockhart, the ruthless yet philosophical head of the Jamaica Voodoo Posse, who believes the gang killer to be of supernatural origin. Shortly thereafter, Willie sees his suspicions confirmed when he comes face to face with the Predator himself. But rather than flee, Willie pulls out his sword cane and stands his ground, even if the ensuing battle is rather short-lived, culminating in the Predator carrying Willie's severed head back to his base as a trophy. Jeremiah Sand, Mandy. Panos Cosmatos' hallucinogenic horror flick Mandy centers around Red, played by Nicolas Cage, and his titular girlfriend, played by Andrea Riseborough, as they're targeted by a religious cult, Children of the New Dawn. The cult's leader, Jeremiah Sand, played by Linus Roach, takes an interest in Mandy, but when she rebukes him, he has her burned alive in front of Red. The cult then takes off, and that seems to be the end of the matter. Or it would have been, except Sand and his goons messed with the wrong alcoholic war veteran lumberjack. Red becomes hell-bent on revenge, tooling up with a crossbow, forging a freaking battle axe, and going murderous full ham on every cultist who stands between him and Sand. And when Red finally gets Sand to himself, he relishes crushing his skull so hard that one of his eyeballs pops out. Clearly Sand didn't expect much, if any, resistance from some down-and-out dude living in the woods. Clyde Parker, Pet Sematary 2. Pet Sematary 2 may not be a great movie, but it does boast one of the all-time most satisfying comeuppances in cinema history, horror or otherwise. Throughout the film, young protagonist Jeff Matthews, played by Edward Furlong, is tormented by a local bully, Clyde, played by Jared Rushton, who at one point threatens to injure Jeff's face with the wheel spokes of his own bicycle. But at this point, Clyde is interrupted by the monstrous Sheriff Gus Gilbert, an incredible Clancy Brown, who, after dying earlier in the film, has been resurrected courtesy of the local Indian burial ground. A wildly unhinged, not all there Gus promptly sends Jeff home, grabs Clyde and holds him close to the fast-moving wheels of his own motorcycle. Though Gus claims to be only messing with Clyde, his scarf ends up getting caught in the wheel, sending his face slamming into it, severely mutilating him. A surprised Gus then decides to finish the job, driving the wheel into Clyde's face and ripping it to shreds. Now, we're not saying Clyde deserved to be murdered here, but come on, the guy was a huge dick. He effed around and he found out. Carter Burke, Aliens. Though the operating villains of James Cameron's Aliens are, of course, well, the aliens, Ripley, of course played by Sigourney Weaver, and the Colonial Marines wouldn't have landed in this mess in the first place without some human intervention courtesy of the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. The hero's guide throughout the mission to investigate the xenomorph-infected colony is Carter Burke, played by Paul Reiser at his slimiest, a smug, stuffed shirt who clearly values pleasing his Weyland-Yutani bosses over the sanctity of human life. It turns out that, at the behest of the company, Burke tricked the colonists into investigating the egg-infested derelict from the first film, with the intent on using the creatures for lucrative biological weapons research. And despite insisting to Ripley that he intends to wipe out the xenomorphs, Burke is lying through his teeth, as he later releases two facehuggers upon Ripley and young Newt, played by Carrie Henn, in an attempt to impregnate them with embryos before heading back to Earth. And so, there was negative sympathy for Burke when he eventually came face to face with a Xeno himself and was promptly mauled to death. Couldn't have happened to a more deserving guy. And, fun fact, if you watch one of the deleted scenes, you will see that Carter was not in fact killed straight away, but was cocooned and presumably impregnated with an embryo. Ripley does show him some kindness in handing him a grenade. Whatever way you look at it, this person seriously got what they deserved. Mason Verger, Hannibal. Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins, may be the cannibalistic antagonist of the entire self-titled franchise, but in 2001's Hannibal, the overarching villain was surely Mason Verger, played by an uncredited Gary Oldman. Verger is a wealthy child molester and Lecter's only surviving victim, who was rendered paralyzed and disfigured by his prior run-in with Hannibal. He spends the movie plotting to capture, torture, and eventually kill Hannibal by feeding him alive to a herd of mutant wild boars he bred purely for this reason, because why the hell not? However, FBI agent Clarice Starling, played by Julianne Moore in this film, ends up freeing Lecter, and Verger gets shoved into the boar pen by one of his own underlings, at which point he's eaten alive by the animals. Props to author Thomas Harris for coming up with a villain somehow even more repugnant than Lecter himself, but as Verger's ultimate fate makes abundantly clear, he just couldn't hold a candle to Hannibal. Richard Vickers, Creepshow. The standout short from cult classic horror anthology Creepshow is Something to Tide You Over, where evil millionaire Richard Vickers, a brilliant Leslie Nielsen, plots to kill his adulterous wife Becky, played by Galen Ross, alongside Harry, played by Ted Danson, the man she's been having an affair with. And Richard's plan effortlessly succeeds. He buries Becky and Harry up to their necks in sand and leaves them to drown when the tide comes in, an outcome he watches with considerable delight from afar via CCTV. Just before Harry dies, he swears revenge on Richard, and indeed, a few hours later, Harry and Becky are resurrected as grotesque, water-rotted zombies. Richard shoots them, only to discover that bullets have no effect on the undead pair, who get exquisite vengeance by doing to Richard precisely what he did to them, burying him in the sand. In the short's final moments, Harry and Becky have vanished, leaving Richard to drown, as will be recorded by his own camera setup for well-deserved posterity. David and Peter, The Cottage. 2008's British horror comedy The Cottage follows David, played by Andy Serkis, and Peter, played by Reese Shearsmith, two brothers who kidnap and ransom Tracy, played by Jennifer Ellison, the daughter of an underworld crime boss. Now, it's quickly made clear that Tracy is far better equipped to take on her bumbling captors than anyone would have expected from appearances alone, but that's just the start of the story. Midway through the film, the trio find themselves preyed upon by a psychotic local farmer/serial killer. By film's end, the farmer has brutally killed Tracy and David, and left one final surprise for Peter, his equally deranged and murderous wife and daughters, who seemingly make short work of him. As a film of two halves, one a dark comedy about a botched kidnapping, the other a grisly slasher flick, The Cottage basically surprised the audience as much as it did its initial antagonists. Dominic, Becky. 2020's action horror flick Becky sees funny man Kevin James play wildly against type as Dominic, a hateful neo-Nazi who breaks into a vacation home in pursuit of a mysterious key. The home happens to belong to a father, Jeff, played by Joel McHale, and his daughter Becky, played by Lulu Wilson. And after Dominic executes Jeff, he turns his attention towards tracking Becky down. But oh boy, old Dom really chose the wrong 13-year-old girl to mess with. The rest of the movie basically becomes a darkly comedic riff on Home Alone, as Becky uses her cunning to outsmart Dominic and kill his gang of hulking brutes in a variety of inventively gnarly ways. This culminates in Becky killing Dominic himself by running over his head with a lawnmower, which probably isn't how he imagined his day would go when he woke up that morning. Sequel The Wrath of Becky more or less repeats the same formula to similarly entertaining effect, except this time Becky faces off against a far-right extremist, Daryl, played by Sean William Scott, and his gang of chuds. Stack, Ball and Bulldog, Tales from the Hood. Another horror anthology pick now with 1995's Tales from the Hood. The frame narrative revolves around three drug dealers: Stack, played by Joe Torre, Ball, played by DeAndre Bonds, and Bulldog, played by Samuel Monroe Jr., who visit a funeral home to buy drugs from its off-putting owner, Mr. Sims, played by Clarence Williams III. During their visit, the trio are regaled by Sims with disturbing stories of some of the corpses in the home, and at film's end, we finally learn that the men were actually responsible for killing the protagonist of one of the stories, a gangster called Crazy K, played by Lamont Bentley. Sims knows what they've done, and when they threaten to kill him, he takes them to 3 caskets containing their own dead bodies. It turns out that Stack, Ball, and Bulldog have been dead the entire time, having been previously killed by Crazy K's associates in revenge. Moreover, the funeral home is actually hell, and Mr. Sims is really Satan, who swiftly leaves them to burn in hellfire forevermore.